salient features of Indian Constitution. Under this cassette, yesterday we have discussed 2 to 3 issues or 2 to 3 points. First point was I think yes, it's the lengthiest constitution. Constitution of the world. This is one of the salient features of our constitution. It's been the lengthiest constitution. Second one we have seen, if we go on to look into the provisions of Indian Constitution, we can find that it is basically comprised of rigid provisions as well as flexible provisions. Means it's a unique blend of rigidity and flexibility. Means it contains both the types of provisions, namely the rigid provisions vis-a-vis the flexible provisions. Fine. Third one we have seen that ours have the provision of parliamentary form of government. Parliamentary form of government. Another salient feature we have mentioned yesterday is the provision of what? Rights and obligations. Rights and obligations under the Constitution. Means our Constitution provides proper space for the incorporation of rights, more precisely you can say the fundamental rights along with some sorts of other constitutional rights, and of course obligations too. Here we usually study about the obligations inside our Constitution in the form of 2 different aspects, 2 different chunks. One chunk simply corroborates towards the obligation to be shown from the side of the state, that is the government, and other to be shown from the side of the individuals. The obligation to be shown from the side of the government is basically called as directive principles of state policy, that is DPSPs, while other is called fundamental duties, which later on incorporated in our Constitution just beside the chapter of directive principles of state policy under Part 4 in our Constitution. Whenever we focus upon the obligations, you will simply get to know that the obligation to be shown from the side of the state, that is DPSP, is mentioned under Part 4, while the obligation to be shown from the side of the individuals, that is fundamental duties, is just stick beside the DPSPs under Part 4A of the Constitution. We'll discuss about this. Why one obligation means which that was to be shown from the side of the state was incorporated in actual Constitution, original Constitution, while second obligation, which is basically to be shown from the side of individual, was incorporated in the Constitution later on by means of one of the constitutional amendment acts, right? So we'll discuss it later on. Another salient feature in the row is also the provision of what? Single citizenship. Single citizenship. Other one is universal suffrage, means the provision of universal suffrage suffrage in our constitution. Another salient feature of our constitution is the provision of single unified judiciary in our country. Single unified judiciary. Another salient feature might be the independence of judiciary. And see, this independence of judiciary is simply taken into account in order to show the supremacy of the constitution. You know, ours have the provision of constitutional supremacy. In the USA, there is a provision of judicial supremacy. In the UK, there is a provision of legislative supremacy, which is often referred to as the supremacy of the parliament. Right? Is my sound echoing? Yes, create some echo. Yes. Because of the last class, it was. Anyway, so basically, today we have to study about, I think, the third salient feature of Indian Constitution, that is the availability of parliamentary form of government. But before proceeding on this point, let's have a flashback upon whatever we studied yesterday, namely the lengthiest constitution of the world, the unique blend of rigidity and flexibility. I am going to sum up these 2 points and accordingly we will proceed upon the other points. See, first, lengthiest constitution of the world. Why the Constitution of India has become the lengthiest constitution in the world? We have seen so many reasons. So many factors are responsible for making the Constitution of India as one of the lengthiest constitutions of the world. For example, see, our constitution is basically a written constitution, and whenever a written constitution is formulated or framed, it is basically an act of constituent assembly of that country. Right? Similarly, the Constitution of India was also written with a well-to-do planning of, with a conscious decision of the constitution makers of our country. And the constitution makers are usually referred to as what? The forefathers of the Constitution. The forefathers of the Constitution. Okay. The forefathers of our Constitution, in due course of, making the Constitution of India, they didn't focus on something original in actuality, right? Because the Constitution of India or the different provisions assigned in the Constitution of India were not the actual creation of the minds of the forefathers of our Constitution. Yeah, they are basically the result of, rational interpretation of those provisions which were already existed across the different sources. For example, suppose the fundamental rights enshrined in Constitution of India under Part 3. Fundamental rights are not the brainchildren of the forefathers of our Constitution. Similarly, whatever the provisions based on directive principles of state policy you usually see under Part 4 of the Constitution, they are also not the brainchildren of forefathers of the Constitution. These classical provisions were basically incorporated from other constitutions. They were simply derived from other constitutions, and after making due deliberations, due senses, so that they could become the fit one in Indian circumstances, they were incorporated. Means they were not the actual creation of the forefathers of the Constitution. They are basically the derived contents, derived items. But one thing also you should remember, those derived contents were not exactly or in the same format as they used to be were incorporated in the Constitution. They were no doubt incorporated in the Constitution from other sources, but after making due changes, due alterations. And why those due alterations were made? Those alterations were made merely for establishing suitability towards the Indian situation. What sort of Indian situation? See, as a country, India is well known for its geographical vastness and cultural diversity. Because of this geographical vastness and cultural diversity, India usually invites a lot of scope for the arising out of challenges without of these vastness and diversities. My direct indication is towards the development of regional aspirations. India is a country where usually we see the suffering of national interests. We people are usually guided by the regional interests. This is also one of the reasons why we have opted for parliamentary form of government instead of the presidential one. Because presidential form of government, wherever it exists, it usually invites the national interests. Because a particular individual is basically voted by entire citizens of the country. But this is not as say in case of India. See, if you focus upon the election of the Prime Minister, who is the head of the Council of Ministers in the Union, don't you think that individual is not elected by the entire voters of the country? He is basically elected by a parliamentary constituency, the voters of a particular parliamentary constituency. It simply reflects towards the regional basis of representation. Anyway, stick upon the topic. Sorry. See, we have been suffering from centuries of colonial ruling. We used to be the colony of Britishers, and wherever colonialism prevails, the people residing in that particular country usually suffers the scope for their overall development. So once we were on the verge of getting independence, the demands to create a constituent assembly in order to formulate the Constitution of India were raised from across the different corners of the country. Right? In order to fulfill the demand, no doubt, in year 1934, 35 you can say. Basically I am saying these two dates because of the fact that for the first time in year 1934, Mr. A.M. Roy, a great communist leader of India and eminent advocate of radical democracy in the country, he for the first time has raised his voice in favor of formulating a constituent assembly so that the Constitution of India can be framed. Following the line, the Congress was this a political organization. It also raised the demand or similar kind of demand to formulate the Constituent Assembly so that the Constitution of India was formulated. Considering the demands raised across the different corners of the country, more precisely the demands raised by the Congress those days, the British government hits upon the demand of the Congress and they agreed to constitute the Constituent Assembly of India during the August offer proposal, right? And finally, the Constituent Assembly of India was constituted or formulated by a means of Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. Okay. After the Constitution of Constituent Assembly of India, one you might also see about the draft Constitution Making Committee, which was constituted on August 29, 1947, which finally provided the exact draft, which would be basically a replica for the Constitution of India we see nowadays. Anyway, that Constitution of India was no doubt constituted or formulated by the Constituent Assembly, and the Constituent Assembly shows the representation across the different corners of the country. That is the reason why we usually see, after having a reference of the preamble to the Constitution of India, that it is none other than the people of India who had adopted, enacted and given to themselves the Constitution of India. Anyway, it is obvious that the Constitution of India is basically a result of well-to-do planning of forefathers of the Constitution directly and the people of India indirectly. Because it's the people of India only who had formulated the Constitution for themselves through the via means of their representatives or representative means either the elected representatives or the nominated representatives. They had formulated their Constitution. See, in due course of writing down the Constitution makers had properly taken care of India's situations. It was well known to them that India is a highly diverse country. India is a highly vast country, very vast country. So, in order to take care of those issues which might confront the diversity and vastness of the country that must be properly addressed. So in order to address all such number of issues, they had incorporated as many provisions as they thought it to be incorporated. Are you getting my point or not? So it could have been the very first reason why the Constitution of India has become that much lengthiest one. Why that much lengthiest one? We have seen that if you focus upon the Constitution of the USA, the Constitution of the USA was originally comprised of 7 articles only. We have seen this point, right? If you focus upon the Constitution of Australia, it was originally comprised of 128 articles only. And if you look into the provisions of the Canadian Constitution, it was originally comprised of 147 or 48 articles only. But what's about the Constitution of India? Originally, it had 395 articles, 22 parts, 8 schedules. And if you focus upon the current Constitution of India, the total number of articles, has been reached up to near about, I think, 460 or 460 plus. The parts of the Indian Constitution have reached up to what? 25. And the total number of schedules being what? 12. So see the vastness of Constitution of India as comparison to other prominent constitutions of the world. Right? Okay. Second point. As I have just dictated, I'm just going to repeat this. Second point being, the Constitution of India is not the actual creation or original creation of the forefathers of the Constitution. The provisions were incorporated under the Constitution based on the fact that, first of all, our forefathers have made the analysis of different successful constitutions of the world. For example, they were very much keen to looking upon the different provisions of the US Constitution, the Irish Constitution, the UK's Constitution, the German's Constitution, etc., etc. And wherever they found that yes, the given provision, the particular provision of this Constitution has been culminated into successful or smooth running of administration and governance of this country, it might also contribute to our own Constitution. For example, it was thought appropriate, it was felt appropriate in the minds of the forefathers of our Constitution that yes, as like the Constitution of the USA, where the individual rights had been properly safeguarded, we should also incorporate such provisions under our Constitution. Following the line, in order to provide proper protection or safeguards to individuals' rights in our country, the concept of fundamental rights was incorporated in our Constitution. They also analyzed that the provisions related to directive principles of state policy is a good one in the Constitution of the Ireland. And it has resulted in effective administration and governance of the country. So they thought that if such type of provisions were also to be incorporated in Indian Constitution, in our situation too, they might culminate in something like fruitful one. Okay, they might culminate into productivity, because it is essential to guide the governments of the day, so that by following those essentials, those guidance, the government may provide a smooth administration and governance to the country, right? So, after having a due deliberation, after having a proper sort of study, proper sort of analysis to distinguish provisions of different successful constitutions of the world, the forefathers of our Constitution had simply derived those constitutions. And after their proper derivation, they didn't directly incorporate them into our Constitution. But after deriving those provisions, they tried their best to make them much suitable in Indian circumstances. Once it was proved that now it is fit one to be incorporated in our Constitution, means it won't be going to challenge the situations or circumstances of the country, they were properly incorporated. This is the reason why we usually refer the Constitution of India is not the fundamental creation of the forefathers of the Constitution, rather it's a derived entity. But remember, it's a derived entity, but not a borrowed bag. It's a derived entity because that is not the actual creation of the forefathers of the Constitution. It has been derived from some other sources. But the derivation of other sources does not mean that they were simply cut from some sources and pasted in Indian Constitution. No. They were not simply cut and pasted in Indian Constitution. Of course they were cut, but after cutting, proper changes were incorporated so that they could remain the fit one in Indian situations. Then only they had been incorporated in the Constitution. Fine. Okay, so it's not a borrowed bag. I have also given you a question to dictate why Indian Constitution is not a borrowed bag, rather it's a derived entity.